Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of the Wild Doggies Fan podcast. If you're new here, please like the video, comment down below, subscribe and stay tuned for all future videos. Welcome to episode 12 and part 2 of 5 of my end of year season review for every team in 2024. Now, before we begin and get into the Pacific Championships of week 1 and the tips for week 2, I want to first extend a huge congratulations to Stephen Crichton. Over the last week, he got married, saw all the videos online. Just wanted to say congratulations to him and his partner. Hope they have a lovely marriage. Now, one last thing as well before we get into Pacific Championships for the men. For the women's game, the Gillaroos had one of the greatest performances I've ever seen and beat the PMG women's team 84-0. That's right, in the modern era, we've seen a team win 84-0. The wingers alone each scored a grand total of 11 tries, 6 by Julia Robertson and 5 by the opposite winger. It was just I watched a bit of that game before the men's game, and my gosh, what an absolute brilliant game. Just want to chuck that in there and show some appreciation for the Gillaroos because that was a brilliant game. Now that's done and dusted, let's dive straight into Pacific Championships for week 1. So the first game was on the Friday night, which was my birthday. Fortunately, I had to go to work for that day, but I still got to catch bits of the game, and I rewatched pretty much the full game afterwards. Australia took on Tonga, and they won 13+, won 18-0. But that scoreboard is not a reflection of how the game played out. Tonga were absolutely fantastic in this game. I think defensively, Australia could have won this game by like 40 with ease. But Tonga's defense just only let them concede 3 tries. That's all they let them concede. One of them was literally at the last 2 minutes of the game. And for Australia, their first try only happened because of an intercept. The other 2, they were good tries at the back end of the game. But overall, Australia, they obviously won 13+ and they played well. But they didn't play the way I thought they would play. I think they had a fair few errors. Their attack seemed a bit clunky. Their halves pairing seemed off. Like Mitch Moses had a pretty poor performance. But you can kind of fault him for it because, it's his first game since he tore his bicep back in Origin Game 3. And for some of these players, it's been a few weeks since they played any footy. Some of them are coming off a grand final as well, win or loss, so their bodies are still recovering or their bodies are a bit fatigued. So you can kind of not be too concerned by the performance. However, there are still a few things I was a bit iffy on. Weirdest one, Matt Burton was on the bench in jersey 14, but only played for 9 minutes. That was a bit of a weird call by Mal. Otherwise than that, it was all good and well from the Kangaroos. They did what we expected. They came out there and they won their game. They got some payback after 2019. But for Tonga, again, their defense was magnificent. I was so impressed with the defense. Their attack, didn't pretty much exist, but man, their defense was unreal. Australia could have easily put a good 40, 50 points on them, but Tonga just did not let them score, a lot. They let them obviously score a couple of tries. I think the player of the game has to be probably the Hammer. He was fantastic. He scored a great try, great tackles. He was phenomenal. So for me, the Hammer was the player of the game. For Tonga, I'd probably give it to Keon Kolomatangi or maybe Hamole Olakawatu. Actually, you know what? Leo Hapawadi, he's my player for Tonga. Yes, he got sin bin, but he was outstanding. His defense, again, he alone stopped a good 3-4 tries just from his tackles. So Hapawadi, I got to give him credit, man. He was great. Otherwise than that, not much else really for this game. The second game on Saturday night, Fiji versus PNG. PNG got the upset win and beat Fiji 22-10. And for a long chunk of this game, Fiji were held pretty much scoreless. They only scored their second try in the 79th minute. And 2 of PNG's tries came off intercepts. And Kikau, oh my gosh, that was rough to watch. Kikau having that kind of performance, I felt really, really concerned, but I don't know. Obviously, the Doggies fan seeing kick out have that kind of performance, dishing out that performance, I was very, very disappointed. But what can you do? PNG they just wanted to win more. They didn't Fiji had the better roster, but PNG still got the win. So full credit to them. I was very impressed with their win. Other than that, not much to cover for these games. This one in particular, I didn't really get to see much of it, but it was still, from what I saw, it was a great game. Fiji just weren't in it. They weren't in it for this game. That's all there really is to it. Now we move on to week 2. For the first game on the Saturday night, 26th of October, 7:10 p.m. This is in, I believe, Fiji. Fiji versus Cook Islands. Now, this one's a bit of a tough one to pick. Because I could very well do what I did last time and pick Fiji to win this thing. But there is a very good chance Cook Islands could win this. However, I think off the back of last week, I think Fiji are going to want to redeem themselves and make up for it. So, I'm going to change it up. I'm going to tip Fiji, but only by 1-12 here. And for my 3 anytime try scorers, honestly, I could pick the same from last week, but I want to change it up a little bit. So I'm first going to, for my first try scorer, Seme Valame. Is that how you say his name? Yeah. So he's going to be my first try scorer. For my second try scorer, I'm going to pick Michael Jennings. And then I think he's going to want to redeem himself. My third try scorer, William McKickout. Those 3, I think they're gonna score. So yeah, Fiji 1-12 with Jennings, Valame, and Kickout as anytime try scorers. Moving on to what will be probably one of the best games we'll see in this whole championship, in my opinion. The Kiwis versus the Kangaroos. This is on Sunday, 27th of October at 4:05 p.m. in Christchurch, New Zealand. So I want to actually cover the teams for this one because I know quite a fair few names. So the fullbacks for the Kiwis, Keanu Kinney. For the Kangaroos, Dylan Edwards. Your 2 wingers for each team. For Kiwis, Jermaine Asako and Will Warbrick. For the Kangaroos, Xavier Coates and Zach Lomax. In the centres, for the Kiwis, Matthew Timoko and Peter Hiku. For the Kangaroos, the Hammer and Tom Toroyevich. At 5'8", for the Kangaroos, Chance Nickel Klukstad. And for the Kangaroos, Tom Dearden. At halfback, for the Kangaroos, Mitch Moses. And for the Kiwis, making his return for what will probably be his final ever game, Sean Johnson. In the forward packs, your 2 props for each team, James Fisher-Harris and Griffin Neame for the Kiwis, Pat Carrigan and Lindsay Collins for the Kangaroos. Your 2 hookers, Phoenix Crossland for the Kiwis, and Harry Grant for the Kangaroos. Your 2 second rowers, Isaiah Papali'i and Scott Sorensen for the Kiwis, Angus Crichton and Cameron Murray for the Kangaroos. At locks, Joseph Tarpany and Isaiah Yeo for each team, obviously. On the bench for each team, Cody Nikorima, Nafadu Hawaii, Marata Nikore, and Jordan Ricky for the Kiwis. For the Kangaroos, Matt Burden, Mitch Barnett, Ruben Cotter, and Hudson Young. And that's it for this team. Now, obviously, this will be the first time these 2 teams have met since last year's huge, shocking game where the Kiwis beat the Kangaroos 30-0, I think was the biggest win the Kiwis have ever had against the Kangaroos. And obviously, it's a different coach now. You know, not certain changes to the squad. But this, I think, could potentially be this could be a really, really good game. Now, obviously, I would love to tip the Kangaroos here because, you know, they're my team and all that. Well, the team I back for this whole championships because, you know, Aussie and all that. But I really like the Kiwis in this one. I don't know, I've got this weird feeling that the Kiwis might pull this off. Nevertheless, I'm still going to back the Kangaroos here, but only by 1-12. For anytime try scorers, I'm actually going to do 4 for this game and 2 from each team. So I'm going to do Will Warbrick for the Kiwis and also for the Kiwis. Who should I pick? You know, I'm going to pick... No, I shouldn't pick him. I think for the Kiwis, I'm going to put... You know what? James Fisher-Harris for anytime try scorer. And then for the Kangaroos, I'm going to put Zach Lomax. Actually, no. I'm going to put Xavier Coates. And the Hammer. Because he's just a reliable try scorer. Alrighty. So that is my tips and predictions for Pacific Championships Week 2. Now, before we cover our end of season stuff, there are two big news stuff regarding signings and players going to other clubs. So the first one, Dallin Watene-Zelezniak is now re-signed with the Warriors until the end of 2027. It's a huge signing for the Warriors. 2023 was obviously Zelezniak's absolute his absolute stellar year. He was an absolute machine, try-scoring freak, always scoring in the corner. He became iconic for that mullet of his. Everyone likes to forget that he played for, I think, both Panthers and the Doggies. So he's a very well-experienced player, and I think having him part of the Warrior system for an even longer period of time is great, and I think he'll do wonders for him. So yeah, congratulations DWZ. I believe he's going to kill it with the Warriors over the next few years. Now we move on to more interesting news. Ben Hunt has been told to speak to other clubs for 2026. However, there is a possibility, depending on what club he goes to, they might be able to get him out of his contract immediately, and he might go straight away. However, I don't think that will happen. Now, there are not many clubs out there that are going to want to sign Ben Hunt, who I believe is like 35. He's at the back end of his career. There's not much really need of him at some clubs. And I think a club that everyone keeps talking about is probably the favourite to sign him. And I've got some mixed opinions on this. And that is the Doggies. The Bulldogs are thinking of, or Bulldogs fans are thinking that maybe Ben Hunt would be a signing we should go for. And we're, I think, listed as one of the favourites to sign him. Now, while yes, I get it, having an experienced halfback playing for it in a side that is so young and inexperienced, I think would be better or would be beneficial. However, I think we should still keep our reliance on Toby Sexton, develop him, build him, and he has the possibility to surpass Ben Hunt, in my opinion. Give him the time, give him the chance. I think he can do it. But that's just my opinion. I don't think Ben Hunt is really the player we need to be signing for the Bulldogs. However, I do understand why signing him would make sense. Like, I get it. He's very well experienced. You know, he's able to really connect with like wingers. He's a great try assist player, and he's used to having to do all the hard work. Like for the Dragons in 2023, Ben Hunt was pretty much their best player because he was just doing so much for them. And even this year, he was one of their better players besides, you know, Zach Lomax, Moses Sully, and Jaden Sewer. Regardless, Ben Hunt was great, but that also raises the question for the Dragons. If Ben Hunt does sign with another club and it's effective immediately, what would happen then moving forward into 2025? No Ben Hunt, no Zach Lomax. Mate, that could do some real damage to the Dragons. However, I'm pretty sure the Dragons have already come out and said that no, Ben Hunt's going to finish his contract with us. He's staying in 2025. So, Dragons fans, you can rest easy knowing that Ben Hunt will play with you guys for at least another year. But it is interesting seeing him after this whole saga the last year or so, where he literally said he doesn't want to play for the Dragons anymore. He wants to go back to Queensland. And all the talks about he might be signing with the Bulldogs, or there's this whole saga with him complaining about the club and everyone making fun of him for pretty much not being able to leave the Dragons. But nevertheless, he's now been told he can go speak to other clubs, and the Ben Hunt era is about to come to an end for the Dragons. Now, let's move on to the best player and players from each team in 2024. Now, this is part of my whole end-of-year wrap-up series. For this one, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through every team, and I'm going to pretty much list my who I think were the best players for each team. Some of them are ranked, some of them aren't. We'll work our way from the bottom to the top. So the first team, the West Tigers. Now, third place, Stefano Oidukamanu. He was absolute gun forward. But really, these next two players were the only real big, major plays for the Tigers this year. Second place, Api Coruscant. He was, the captain. He was doing everything he could to try and help this team. But the absolute standout, and it goes without saying, Lachlan Galvin. He was nothing short but sensational this year. Should have been Rookie of the Year. Wasn't given to him. Don't know why. But yeah, for me, Lachlan Galvin was the Tigers Player of the Year. Now we move on to the Warriors. Finding a third place was really hard because there weren't that many players this year from the Warriors that were real big standouts. Look, 3 at least. So for this one, purely because it was his last year, I'm going to give it to SJ. Purely because of that. But really, the best 2 players for them this year were, without a doubt, their 2 forwards, AFB and Mitch Barnett. They were, in my opinion, the best 2 forwards in the comp this year. So yeah, it goes without saying they were the Warriors' best players for their respective clubs. I think to me that makes the most sense. Moving on to the Titans. So the 3 best players from their club is Alofiana Khan Pereira, top try scorer, outstanding this year. Jaden Campbell broke the points for the most amount of points scored by a Titan ever. And then their breakout player, Keanu Kinney, he was brilliant this year. He has the potential to be one of the best fullbacks we've ever seen. Moving on to the Melbourne Storm. In third place, Eli Katoa. He was one of the best second rowers this year. And yeah, he was nothing short of fantastic. He was really good. In second place, Harry Grant. Best hooker this year. One of the best captains. Went all the way to a grand final and scored the first try. So he was one of my favourites. But my favourite player for the Melbourne Storm this year was Jerome Hughes. Dally M winner, best player in the comp this year, best halfback this year. It was going to be Jerome Hughes. Now I move on to the Sharkies. My 3 players are Carla Iro, an absolute gun rookie this year. Really earned his way into the side. He did well for me on Supercoach as well. Braden Trindle most likely should be the halfback for the Sharks moving forward. And Nick Khan should either be in the 6 or the 1, in my opinion. But their best player this year, and one of my favourites, Cam McInnes. The real definition of just a grunt player. The way he's always in his face cut up, he's always in the tackle, he's always there doing the big plays. So yeah, for me, Cam McInnes was the best player for him this year. For the Manly Sea Eagles, Luke Brooks, one of the best signings this year. Finally got to play finals for the first time. He was fantastic. Then Big Hamole Olakawatu, got picked for the Origin side. I don't think he ever got to play, but he was there in the Origin side. He was fantastic this year. A lot of big hits. He really had a chance to stand up. But for me, the number 1 player, even though he didn't get to play a whole lot of games, but towards the back end he was fantastic, Tom Trbojevic. He was so good. I think they're top try scorer even. Moving on to the Roosters. In third place, Sam Walker. He was, again, if he didn't tear his ACL, I think him being part of the Roosters, he could have easily taken them to a far better, maybe not grand final, but maybe a better performance against Melbourne at best. Moving on to Angus Crichton, in my opinion, the second rower of the year. Also one of the greatest comeback stories of this year. Went from playing in Reggie's, going all the way to winning the Wally Lewis medal in Origin, playing for Australia, playing, in a preliminary final. He was fantastic. For me, their best player, though, was, without a doubt, James Tedesco. He was the fullback of the year, Roosters player of the year. He was Real return to his old 2019-2018 form. Moving on to the Raiders. We have Jamal Fogarty. His kicking game was immense, and his goal conversion percentage was fantastic. Hudson Young got the chance to play Origin this year, and was really fantastic. But for me, my player of the year for the Raiders, without doubt, Joseph Tarpany. He was really good, one of the best forwards this year, and he's now been picked to be the Raiders captain for next year. Moving on to the Bunnies. In third place, Cam Murray. He was just a proper player. He was always giving his all. When he was in the post-game press conference rooms, he always looked so defeated after a loss. Second place, Keon Kolomatangi. Really showcased his versatility in different positions and showcased Wen Bennett where the most ideal spot should be for him next year. And for me, their best player was Cody Walker. When the chips were down, he absolutely stood up and did everything he could during that 6-7 week period where they kept on winning. He was instrumental in those wins. So for me, he was their player of the year. Alright, for the Panthers, in third place, Jerome Luai. What else can I say? When Cleary was gone for a big chunk of the year, Luai stood up in the halfback and became a gun halfback and showcased the Tigers what he has to offer for next year. And even when Cleary was back, he was such a great ball runner. Yeah, for me, Jerome Luai was fantastic. Brian Doyle in second place. He was one of my wingers of the year. He was outstanding. He was really good. But for me, the Panthers player of the year has to be Isaiah Yeo. He had his best year I think he's ever had for the Panthers, and that's saying a lot. He's been a part of the system for so long. He was great at running straight at the line and just trying to powerhouse his way through everyone. They centered their entire attacking around Yeo, and the way he's such a great ball-playing lock. For me, he was the Panthers player of the year. For the Newcastle Knights, in third place, Dane Gagai. There's not really much I can say about him. He was just really good. Second place, Bradman Best. If he was fully fit for the whole year, I reckon Newcastle would have had a much better performance overall and probably would have had a better run in the 8. But number one has to be Kalen Ponga. He pretty much carried Newcastle into the finals at one point. It was pretty bad. For the Eels, in third place, Dylan Brown, very similar to Jerome Luai, really stood up when Mitch Moses was down and out. In second place, Blaze Talangi, absolute gun player. Real shame they let him go to the Panthers, but typical Parramatta, they screw it up. They screw up even the most smallest of things. In first place, though, Mitch Moses, when he was there on the side, except for the Bulldogs game, he was really good. The Doggies game was the only game where he went really quiet, but that's what happens when there's some pressure on the line. He and all Parramatta buckle. Anyway, moving on to the Dragons. In third place, I'm going to give it to Jaden Sewer. Got to play Origin. He was a great second rower this year. In second place, Ben Hunt. Most try assists. He was outstanding. But without a doubt, the number one player was Zach Lomax. Played Origin, plays for the Kangaroos. Became one of the best wingers this year. And now he's going to Parramatta and is now going to play centre. So, big fall from grace for Zach Lomax, but what can you do? Moving on to the Dolphins. In third place, Jack Bostock. Another outstanding rookie this year. Scored some great tries, had some great performances. In second place, the Hammer. If the Dolphins ever needed one player to try and change the momentum of the game, it was the Hammer. He had so many outstanding moments this year. Did alright in Origin. He's playing for Australia. He's been really good. But for me, their best player this year was Max Plath. Another absolute gun rookie. Potential Queenslander moving forward. So yeah, for me, Max Plath, their player of the year. Moving on to the Cowboys. Two of these players are actually not even part of the club next year. In third place, Kyle Felt. Great return to form. I think scored the most tries he ever scored in a season as a Cowboy. Actually, he's not ever played for the Cowboys, but you get my point. He scored the most points ever, or the most tries in a single season by a Cowboy by his standards. He was outstanding. Val Holmes in second place. He was at moments, a bit lacking defensively, but otherwise than that, he was outstanding. But for me, without a doubt, one of the best 5'8" this year, Tom Dearden, he deserves the number 1 spot. Moving on to the Brisbane Broncos. In third place, Reece Walsh. Yes, he was a bit different after the KO from Joseph Swiley, but he was still a great fullback this year, was able to produce some miracle moments. So he's my third best player for the Broncos. Second place, Pat Carrigan. He was arguably the hardest worker this year. He was one of the only few players who genuinely was giving it his all when he was playing. But without a doubt, their number 1 player was Tony Staggs. He did everything he possibly could to try and save the Broncos season this year. His standout games were the Cowboys game. Even in the Bulldogs game, he was their best player. He scored that really good try against us right before halftime. He was also their hardest worker. So for me, Tony Staggs was their player of the year. Finally, we'll cover the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs. This was actually a bit of a hard one. In third place, I'm going to give it to Jacob Kiraz, the Lebanese international. He was, in my opinion, the winger of the year, had the most run meters, scored some really cool tries. In second place, Matty Burton, his kicking game was nothing short of sensational. His field goals were great. Yes, his conversions were a bit 50-50, but besides that, he is such an integral part of the side that we look so lost without him. But easily number 1 has to be Stephen Crichton. The impact he's had on our side is nothing short of sensational. And for me, he was our player of the year. He was the Bulldogs player of the year. He was fantastic. So the last thing we'll do before we cover the middle 4 teams on the ladder, I want to do the best player or the best players of the 2024 season. A few of these are going to make sense. Some of them are my own personal picks. But here they are. This is my top 10 players of the year. In 10th place, Brian To'o. In 9th place, Tom Dearden. In 8th place, Jerome Luai. In 7th place, Eli Katoa. In 6th place, Jacob Kiraz. In 5th place, Isaiah Yeo. In 4th place, Angus Crichton. In 3rd place, Stephen Crichton. In 2nd place, James Tedesco. And in 1st place, without a doubt, Jerome Hughes. Now we're going to break down each player briefly. Brian To'o, outstanding winger, scored a lot of tries this year, created post-contact meters as a stat, and I think he had the most this year. He was great. Tom Dearden, the running engine for the Cowboys. Take him out of that side, they're like a bottom 4 team. Tom Dearden was outstanding this year. Earned the 5'8" Dally M, and even had a chance to step it up in Origin, and it was actually one of their best players for Queensland. Then in 8th place, Jerome Luai. Great backup when Cleary was down and out. Tigers fans should be very happy with what they're going to get for him next year. In 7th place, Eli Katoa, one of the best second rows of the year. Was nothing short of outstanding. He was great. In 6th place, Jacob Kiraz, the Lebanese international. Need I say more? Most run meters, great tries, and overall was just an outstanding workhorse this year. In 5th place, Isaiah Yeo, easily his best year he's ever had for the Panthers. Was outstanding through the middle and was a great shout to potentially win the Clive Churchill Medal in the grand final. In 4th place, Angus Crichton, Wally Lewis medal winner, playing for Australia, Origin, doing all this great stuff. The best second row in the comp by a mile, but he started the year in Reggie's. What a comeback story. In 3rd place, Stephen Crichton, the most influential signing of the year, most influential player in a team. Biggest turnaround for a team was through him. His leadership, his attack and defense, he was outstanding. He was easily one of the best players of the year. 2nd place, James Tedesco, best fullback of the year. Real standout for the Roosters, had a great return to form. Got to play Origin, and he was great. But easy number one was Jerome Hughes. He won the Dally M for a reason. He was fantastic. He had a real standout year, in my opinion. So with that, that is a wrap to my best players from each team in 2024 and the best players of season 2024. Like best players from each club and the best players of the year overall. So now we move on to our final topic of the day. Our season review for the Warriors, Broncos, Dragons, and the Dolphins. That is the middle four teams of the ladder. So, just like last week, we'll cover each team, break down the stats that were given to us by bloke in the bar. That is where I get my stats from for these guys. However, we're going to do a bit different than how we did last week. We're going to cover maybe some standout players, standout games, some really bad games that they had, all the good stuff in between. So, we'll get things started with the 13th place New Zealand Warriors. So, in 2024, they placed, as I said, 13th, 9 wins, 1 draw, and 14 losses. They scored 512 points and conceded 574. When you compare that to last year, they came 4th. They had 16 wins and 8 losses. Like, that is a crazy comparison, if you ask me. So, in terms of attacking stats, they scored on average 21 points a game. This stat right here really stood out to me. Tackle in the opposition 20, 31.1 per game. That is the most. So even though they came 13th, they were attacking the opponents. They were in the opponent's red zone area the most out of any team this year. That goes to show that, like, despite coming 13th, they were in it for so many games and they had so many attacking opportunities this year. They failed to ice it. Completion rate 82%. Actually, first, they actually completed the most. Defense and discipline. So, they conceded 23.9 points per game, which was 9th. They conceded about 5 penalties per game. They had 5 sin bins across the whole year and 0 send-offs. So, looking at their seasons and as their draw, they started out the year with 2 back-to-back losses that they really should have won against the Sharks and the Sharks and the Melbourne Storm. Then they went on 3 wins in a row against the Raiders, Newcastle, and South Sydney. South Sydney was 34-4, which was one of their best games of the year. They then had a draw against Manly. And then they went on a really bad losing streak. They lost to the Dragons, the Titans, the Knights, and the Roosters. Then they got the shocking win of the year and beat the Panthers 22-20. Then they beat the Dolphins the very next week with one of the worst sides I've ever seen because they were so injury-ridden. Then they had their first bye of the year. Then they go on to beat the Cowboys quite convincingly. Then they go on to lose badly by the Melbourne Storm and then get smashed 66 points to 6 by the Titans. They then beat the Broncos in New Zealand. Then they lose by 1 point to the Bulldogs in Golden Point in round 19. They didn't have in round 18. Round 19 they had the bye. They then lose by 2 points against the Raiders in round 20. They beat the Tigers 28-16. And then they pretty much lose nearly every game for the rest of the year. They lose to the Eels, Dolphins, Manly, and the Bulldogs. Then they get their last win of the year against the Sharks. They win by 2 points. They have a bye round 27 and they end up missing the 8. So overall, even though this was a very disappointing year for the Warriors, a lot of these games were close losses. Like the Panthers, no, they won that one, sorry. But the first 2 losses, Sharks and Melbourne, they lose 16-12 in the first game. And then in the Melbourne game, they really should have won that. They only lost to one of the greatest tries we've ever seen with Xavier Coates' last second try. You then look, they had the draw against Manly. They really should have won that game. They lose by 3 points to the Titans, lost by 6 to Newcastle. They lost by 1 point to the Bulldogs. They lost by 2 points to the Raiders. They lost by 2 against the Dolphins in a Golden Point game. Like, they had a lot of close losses this year. Like, if they had just iced those couple of games, they could have easily been, like, pushing for top 8, if not maybe in the top 8. So now we're going to we'll do their standout player of the year. There's really 2 to pick from. We'll do 2 of their best games and 2 of their worst losses. So easily their best 2 players this year were AFB and Mitch Barnett. Their forwards were outstanding this year. Real shame that AFB is going to the Sharkies next year, but they get James Fisher-Harris in return. So, fair trade, in my opinion. Or a really good upgrade, in my opinion. Mitch Barnett as well got the chance to go play Origin, playing for the Kangaroos. He's had just a breakout year, in my opinion. So now, their worst losses of the year. Easily one of them has to be the 66-6 against the Titans. Like, that was a shocking performance. Like, I did not see that coming by a mile. But I think another really bad loss of theirs this year, having to read through all their stats. I think it has to be having a look. I want to pick one. They're really like the big loss. You know what? The Roosters game in round 10. They lost 38 points to 18. Roosters scored 22 points in the first 20 minutes. That was easily one of their worst performances. Now their best wins. Easily one of them is the upset win over the Penrith Panthers in round 11. And they won 22-20. No one saw that coming by a mile. There was no Sean Johnson, no Tohu Harris. A few other players were injured for the Warriors. They pretty much had no one. And they beat the Panthers. So that was their best win this year. But another win I want to give them credit for was the one against South Sydney when they won 34 points to 4. That was an absolute thrashing, in my opinion. Otherwise than that, not much else about the Warriors. Really disappointing. I expected a bit more from them this year, but they weren't as disappointing when you compare them to the very next team, which will then lead me to move on to the 12th placed Brisbane Broncos. As I just said, they finished 12th. They had 10 wins and 14 losses. They scored 537 points but conceded 607. When you look at that to last year, they came second with 18 wins and 6 losses. They scored 639 points and only conceded 425. Like that to me, this to me shows that the Broncos were easily, without a doubt, the most disappointing team of 2024. The biggest letdown. Going from 20 minutes away from a premiership to not even making the 8. And it even shows in some of their attacking stats. They scored 22 points a game. They came 15th they came last for the most offloads. So they barely offloaded the ball. They had the least amount of tackles in opposition 20 with only 22 per game. They had the most errors per game with 11.5. And they completed 77%, which is one of the worst completion rates I've ever seen. And then you have a look at their defense and discipline stats. They conceded on average 25 points a game. They missed about 32 tackles a game. They conceded about, 5 penalties per game. And they had 4 sin bins across the entire year. And you look at their draw. They first lost to the Roosters. No one saw that coming. They then beat South Sydney. They lost to Panthers and they beat the Cowboys. And they lose to Melbourne. So, win, loss, loss, win, loss, win, loss. Then they go on a bit of a run. They beat the Dolphins, the Raiders and Tigers, all convincingly. They lose to the Roosters again and they get smashed. I think that's the game where... That could have been the game where Adam Reynolds tears his bicep. Yeah, I think it was. They then go on to beat the Eels and Manly. They beat Manly by 1 point. And then they go on this huge losing streak. They lose by 2 points to the Titans. They then have the bye. They then lose to Sharks and Souths. They then lose to the Warriors, the Panthers, and the Dragons. Then they finally get a win over the Newcastle Knights. and their season's pretty much on the line at this point. And then they get absolutely hammered in back-to-back weeks. First, they get thumped by the Bulldogs, 41 points to 16. Then the very next week, the Titans eviscerate them and beat them 46 to 18. And after those 2 weeks, then they go on to beat the Cowboys, 42 points to 18. Then they beat the Eagles, 30 to 24. And just when their season's on the line, they then get absolutely annihilated by their little brother, the Dolphins, and they lose 40 points to 6, and their season is effectively over. And then their final game, the Storm, put the nail was already in their coffin, but they kind of chucked the coffin in the grave. 50 points to 12. With a Jerome Hughes and Will Warbrick hat-trick each. This was such a disappointing year. The fact they had the most errors by any team, that means any time they had the ball, or most times they had the ball, they try and spread it out wide, and then boom, they drop it. I remember in the Doggies game, where Preston runs up and just hits Walsh, and Walsh just drops it. Just like that. A few other cases where they're trying to shift the ball out, and they keep dropping it. And last year they could make up for it, because they'd make these errors, but then they'd score a shit ton of points, and you kind of forget about it. And unless you could keep up with that tempo, mate, they would just keep scoring points on you, even if they made 1 or 2 errors. As soon as they get the ball back, it was try time. I think the game that really showcased how far they'd fallen from grace, and I know it sounds biased as hell, but the Doggies game. Every time we shifted the ball out, or we spread the ball, Broncos got confused, they didn't know what to do, and we'd score points. Even at the Titans game, they had a bit of a fight back, but in the second half, Titans just ran away with it and just kept scoring try after try. It was just a shocking year. And yes, I understand they were riddled with injuries. They had Adam Reynolds out for a long time. Walshy got concussed and again in Origin and just was never the same when he came back. He was always in and out the side of Origin. Actually, Origin overall really affected them. They had players kept coming in and out of the team. Players kept getting injured at Origin, or just they got injured in general. It was a really messy year for them. They had stuff like the whole Cobo incident, which took them out of the game for a few weeks. It was just a really disappointing. I can't emphasize it any more than I can that the Broncos were just absolutely disappointing this year. Also, I just realized I forgot to give the Warriors a rating out of 10 in their score. How silly of me. Wow. So we're going to just chuck this in the middle of the segment. We're going to cut back to it now. So, for the Warriors, I'm giving them a 4.5 out of 10 with a rating of a D. Can't believe I forgot that. How silly of me. Anyway, for the Broncos, we'll do the 2 standout players and then the 2 standout wins and 2 standout losses. So their 2 best players were Tony Staggs and Pat Carrigan. They're really the only 2 good players this year for them. Their 2 best wins, their first one was against the Cowboys when they beat them 42 to 18. And the second one was against probably the Raiders when they beat them 34-10. Their 2 standout losses were actually in back-to-back weeks against the Bulldogs and the Titans, when they got over 40 points conceded on them twice and they lost. Actually, no. We'll take away the Titans game. Doggies was easily their worst loss this year. And then the Dolphins game, the nail in the coffin that ended their season. So those 2 are their 2 worst losses. So for the Broncos, I'm going to give them a 4 out of 10 with a D-. It was, again, the most disappointing team of 2024. Now we move on to who were easily the most inconsistent team of 2024. The St. George Illawarra Dragons. They came 11th this year with 11 wins and 13 losses. They scored 508 points this year and conceded 634. When you look at last year, they came 16th with 5 wins and 19 losses. They scored 474 points and conceded 673. So a bit better defensively and attacking-wise. You look at their attacking stats. They scored about 21 points a game. They had about 11 errors a game as well, or 10.9, so they came second. They came second in terms of Errors, they completed at 78%, which is 14, which is also really poor. Defensively, they conceded 26.4 points a game. They conceded about 5 penalties a game. They had 3 sin-bins across the whole year, which is actually the second least amount. 0 send-offs. Now you look at their draw. This is what I mean by the most inconsistent. So, they beat the Titans 28-4 in the first week. They then lose 38-0 to the Dolphins the next week, and then they lose to Cowboys. They beat Manly. They lose to Newcastle. They then go back-to-back wins against Warriors and Tigers and Warriors. Then they go back-to-back losses, Roosters and Sharks. And then this is where, or nearly. Then they beat Souths. They had the bye. They lose to the Doggies. They go back-to-back against somehow Panthers, and then they eviscerate the Tigers. And this is where it starts. So, win against Tigers, lose against Manly. Win against Dolphins, lose against Roosters. Win against Broncos, lose against Penrith. Win against Melbourne, lose against Bulldogs. Win against the Titans, and then they go lost to Sharks, lost to Eels, lost to Raiders. Like that's unbelievable. To go win, loss so long. That's what I mean by the most inconsistent team. One week they'd win, next week they'd lose. It all then kind of, imploded and they then lose their last 3 games consecutively. They were in the 8 for a good chunk of this year, and they just faded away at the back end of the year. Like, it was just really, it's really interesting to say at the least. Like, it was a very, like, I didn't know where the Dragons would actually end up this year. I thought they'd be like bottom 4 maybe pushing for like the middle of the 8. But then to be in the 8 for so long, or pushing 8th for so long, to then have 3 consecutive losses to cause you to fade out, that's really disappointing. The fact that they beat both the Panthers and the Melbourne Storm in in their home ground, they beat Penrith and Melbourne in Melbourne. The 2 grand finalists, they beat them this year, and they didn't even make the 8. Like, that's crazy. Like, it's astounding. Now, for their best players this year, easily, Zach Lomax was their outstanding player. Origin, Kangaroos, killing it. And the other one, Ben Hunt. Most try assists. Kept linking up with Lomax a good chunk of this year. Their 2 best wins. Well, that's a bit of a tough one, actually. Actually, I don't know. One of them was against the Warriors in round 7. And the other one was against the Melbourne Storm in round 22. And they beat them 18 points to 16 and had their first ever win against the Melbourne Storm in Melbourne in 25 years. Now their worst losses of the year. Easy without a doubt was the week prior, before the Storm, when they'd lost to the Panthers, 46 points to 10, where Nathan Cleary scored a hat-trick. That was pretty bad. And then their other loss, as much as I want to give it to one of their Bulldogs losses, I got to give it to the Roosters in round 8. When they beat them 60 points to 18. Like, that was a really, really bad game from the Dragons. They looked shot. They looked terrible. Another shout-out was the Eels game where they lost by 4 points, even though they scored 40. They had some really bad losses this year. But their worst 2 is probably the Roosters and Panthers games. So, for an overall ranking, I'm going to give the Dragons, since they were they were literally average this year, I'm giving them a 5 out of 10, right in the middle, and a C-. Now we move on to our last team of the week for this week. We have the 10th placed Redcliffe Dolphins. So, as I just said, they finished 10th, 11 wins and 13 losses. They scored 577 points and conceded 578. They only conceded 1 more point than they scored. Like, that's pretty huge. And you look at their 2023 season. They came 13th, 9 wins, 15 losses. They scored 520 points and conceded 631. So, massive improvement. For attacking stats, scored 24 points a game. They had actually a lot of errors as well, 9.5 per game, 15th. and they completed 79%. Their defense and discipline stats, they conceded 21.1 points a game. They missed about 34.8 tackles per game, conceded 5.7 penalties per game. They had 7 sin bins across the whole year with no send-offs. Now you have a look at their draw. They get whooped by the Cowboys week 1 and lose 43 points to 18. They then have a massive turnaround and beat the Dragons 38-0 where the Hammer gets a hat trick. They beat the Titans and the Tigers. They lose to Broncos. They beat the Eels. They lose to Newcastle. They then beat Cowboys, Manly and Tigers. They then lose to Warriors and Raiders. They beat the Sharks. Lose to Storm. Lose to Dragons. They beat Souths. And they go on a bit of a losing streak. They lose to Panthers, Titans and Roosters. They beat the Warriors. But then they go back-to-back against Bulldogs and Melbourne. They then beat the Broncos. And then they lose to Newcastle. They were pushing top 4. I remember after their win against the Sharks in round 15, they were top 4. Like, they were pushing for a top 4 spot. And it looked quite certain that they were going to make the 8 this year. Like, that was really impressive. I was very impressed by them this year. But then, towards the back end of the year, lack of defense, like, their attack fell off. They became very fatigued. Like, I remember for a long time, in the second half of a lot of games, they'd fade away. It looked like they'd just forgotten how to play rugby league. It was very, very weird. But again, that's their lack of depth catching up to them and the overall fatigue. And they're a very young, inexperienced squad, so you can't really fault them for it. Looking at their best players of the year. Actually, before I do that, I just want to say, I am very disappointed they didn't make the 8 this year. Like, to be in top 4 and to be in the 8 for so long, and like high in the 8 for so long, to then fade out and like have so many bad losses, like that loss to Melbourne was abysmal. Or even like, their win against the Warriors, they really shouldn't have won that game, but they did. And then they'd have games like the one against the Sharks where they should not have won that game, but they did. And then there's really great games like the one against the Dragons or the one against Eels. Like, that was fantastic. It was a really weird year for them. Like, they really should have been in the 8, and in my opinion, I reckon if they beat Newcastle, they would have beaten the Cowboys. They probably would have versed the Sharkies week 2 of finals, which would have been a really, really good game, if you ask me. Anyway, their best players of the year. Easy one of them was the Hammer. It was, like, you look at a highlight reel, he has one of the best highlight reels for the Dolphins. And then Max Plath, which is a great emergence of a player. Future Origin player, he was fantastic. Now you have a look at their 2 best wins and their 2 worst losses. We'll do their worst losses first. Easily one of them was against the Melbourne Storm when they lost 48 points to 6. That was a pretty bad loss. And another one was, having a quick read through, probably round 1 against the Cowboys, 43 points to 18. Like, that was really bad. I had high hopes they'd win that game. And I remember Hammer had probably one of his worst performances ever in that game. You then look at their best wins. I actually know which 2. First one was their bounce-back game after losing round 1 and round 2 when they beat the Dragons, 38-0. The Hammer gets a hat-trick. Like, that was a fantastic game from the Dolphins. But, in my opinion, not only was this their best win this year, this was the best game their club has ever had in their first 2 years. This was easily, without doubt, their best win ever. When they beat the Broncos round 26, 40 points to 6. That was honestly one of my favorite games this year. Like, to have them end their season like that, like Wayne Bennett coaching this side, and he's gone against his former club that he had all those glory days with, to then be the team to end the Broncos season permanently for this year. That's such a beautiful, poetic way to end the Broncos season. Getting beaten by the team that was like their little brother. In the Battle of Brisbane, fight for their season. Like, I couldn't have scripted any better. And yeah, I think that was their best win they've ever had. Was beating the Broncos 40 points to 6. Before I give my rating and score, another thing I want to mention is Wayne Bennett. the most experienced coach. I think it's really going to be interesting seeing next year how they go without him coaching their squad. I think he'd be a bit disappointed how it ended for him here because, normally when it's his second year at a club, normally they make the 8 and they play finals, but first time for everything. We'll see what he does at South next year, and we'll see how the Dolphins go without Wayne Bennett in their side. And also having JMK, Jeremy Marshall-King, with them for the whole year because he was out for, I think, after the Dragons game, he didn't come back until the last couple of weeks. So we're very curious to see how that goes next year for him. So, in saying that, I'm going to give the Dolphins... This will be a bit of an interesting one, actually. What should I give them? Because I have a few... they had an alright year, but they had some really, really bad performances. Alright, I think I'm going to give... You know what? I know. I'm going to give the Dolphins a 6 out of 10 and give them a C overall. So, that leads me into next week. We've now covered the middle 4 teams of the ladder. Now we're going to move on to the middle of the... Not middle of the 8. This was the bottom of the 8. So next week we're going to be doing... It's going to be a bit different. We're going to do the Raiders, the Knights, the Sea Eagles, and the Cowboys. I know obviously you're all noticing a team... It should be the Bulldogs next week, but since they're my team, I want to do a very separate video for them. So instead, in part 3 of next week, we're doing the Canberra Raiders, the Newcastle Knights, the Manly Sea Eagles, and the North Queensland Cowboys. Then the following week after that, we'll do the Cronulla Sharks, Sydney Roosters, Penrith Panthers, and Melbourne Storm. And then last week, we'll be doing the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs. And so with that, I believe we're done for the day. Alright everybody, thank you for listening to another episode of the Wild Doggies Fan podcast. If you're new here, please like the video, comment down below, subscribe and stay tuned for all future videos. Also, please follow me on Instagram at the Wild Doggies Fan, which should now be up on the screen. I post a lot of content on there, edits, memes, footy content. We're on the road to 100 followers. By the end of the year, that is the end goal. Check out all my videos. And thank you all for listening to this week's episode. I hope you all enjoyed it. I know I did. Stay tuned for next week. And I'll see you all for another episode of the Wild Doggies Fan podcast.